The snow fell gently over Brindlebrook, blanketing the small town in a soft, quiet white. Jack Sullivan stood in his dimly lit workshop, the faint hum of his tools the only sound breaking the stillness. A small wooden train sat on his workbench, its wheels wobbling from wear and time. Jack adjusted the axle with care, his hands steady despite the deep ache in his heart that had never quite left him. Every toy he fixed, every secret act of kindness he performed, was his way of atoning for a loss that haunted him. Brindlebrook knew Jack only as the man who lived alone on the edge of town, a quiet recluse who helped anonymously. He avoided gatherings and never accepted thanks. But despite his distance, his acts of goodwill were the thread that wove the community together during hard winters like this one. On this particular day, the chill in the air seemed sharper, and the town buzzed with whispers of new arrivals. Eleanor Ward had come to Brindlebrook, her sleek black car turning heads as it rolled down Main Street. She was everything the townspeople were not: poised, wealthy, and utterly out of place in a town built on hard work and modest lives. Yet her reason for coming seemed noble enough. She claimed to be here to save the struggling orphans at St. Mary's Home from being displaced by a developer's plans for a shopping mall. Jack noticed none of this as he packed up the toy train, placed it in a box, and set it on his worn sled. He pulled it through the snowy streets, delivering it to the doorstep of a family whose children he'd seen peeking longingly into the toy store window. As he turned to leave, he saw a small figure standing a short distance away, watching him. The boy was thin, bundled in an oversized coat, with bright, curious eyes that seemed to cut through the icy air. Jack paused, his breath visible in the cold. "You're Jack Sullivan," the boy said, his voice carrying a confidence that caught Jack off guard. Jack didn't respond immediately, but something in the boy's gaze made him linger. "People say you fix things," the boy continued, holding out an object. It was a camera, old and battered, its leather casing cracked and peeling. Jack took it, examining it with practiced hands. The lens was clouded, the shutter stuck. "Where'd you get this?" Jack asked, his tone gruff but not unkind. "It was left for me," the boy said. "I think it's magic. Can you fix it?" Jack almost laughed but stopped himself. There was a quiet desperation in the boy's eyes that he couldn't ignore. "What's your name?" Jack asked instead. "Sam," the boy replied. Jack hesitated. He didn't take requests, especially not ones that came with strange stories. But something about Sam tugged at him, a familiarity he couldn't place. He sighed, slipping the camera into his coat pocket. "I'll see what I can do," he said, turning back toward his workshop. Sam followed him, uninvited but not unwelcome. Jack didn't have the heart to send him away. Inside the workshop, Sam's wide eyes took in the shelves lined with toys in various stages of repair. Jack set the camera on his workbench, carefully disassembling it while Sam peppered him with questions. "Do you believe in magic?" Sam asked, leaning on the table. "No," Jack replied flatly, focusing on the intricate gears. "Why not?" Jack didn't answer. The truth was too heavy to share with a boy he'd just met. Instead, he worked in silence, letting the rhythmic precision of his hands speak for him. Sam didn't seem to mind the quiet. He began exploring the workshop, picking up a wooden car, a painted doll, a puzzle missing one piece. "Do you make all these?" Sam asked. "Fix them," Jack corrected. Sam nodded, setting the car back on the shelf. "Why?" Jack paused, his fingers hovering over the camera. He didn't have an answer that would make sense to a child. "People need things fixed," he said finally. The boy seemed to accept that. As the hours passed, Jack found himself softening toward the boy's endless curiosity. There was something disarming about Sam, something that made Jack feel lighter, even if only for a moment. When the camera was finally restored, Jack handed it back to Sam. "It's not magic," Jack said, "but it works." Sam smiled, holding the camera close. "Maybe it's both." Jack shook his head, but the corner of his mouth twitched, almost forming a smile. As the boy left, trudging through the snow with his newly fixed treasure, Jack stood at the window watching him disappear into the night. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a fragile spark of hope, faint but unmistakable. The following morning, Jack stepped out into the biting cold, the crunch of fresh snow under his boots the only sound in the stillness. He couldn't shake the lingering thoughts of Sam. The boy's peculiar request, his strange confidence. It all stuck with him in a way Jack didn't understand. He busied himself with routine tasks, dropping off firewood to an elderly neighbor and leaving a sack of groceries on the church steps, but his mind kept circling back to the boy with the old camera. Brindlebrook was alive with chatter that day. Eleanor Ward's arrival had stirred curiosity and skepticism in equal measure. Jack overheard snippets as he moved through town. What does she want here? Probably just another big shot looking to take advantage of us. She's trying to save the orphans, they say. Doesn't seem the type. Jack filed the comments away, not caring much for gossip. But as he passed by St. Mary's home later that afternoon, something caught his attention. Sam was outside, bundled in his too large coat, fiddling with the camera Jack had repaired. His face lit up when he saw Jack, and before Jack could think to turn away, the boy was running toward him, camera in hand. "It works," Sam exclaimed, holding the camera up proudly. "Look, I took this picture of the snowman we made earlier." He handed Jack a crumpled print, the edges still slightly damp from the developing process. The image was rough, but it was clear. A snowman standing tall in the orphanage yard, its crooked arms raised in triumph. Jack couldn't help but smile, if only faintly. "Not bad," he said, handing the photo back. Sam fell into step beside him, his small boots leaving hurried prints next to Jack's slower, heavier ones. "Do you think pictures can show things other people can't see?" Sam asked, his tone earnest. Jack frowned slightly, not sure where the boy was going with this. "What kind of things?" Sam hesitated, clutching the camera tightly. "Like truths. Things people hide." Jack's chest tightened. The question hit closer to home than he cared to admit. "Pictures show what's there," he said gruffly. "Nothing more, nothing less." Sam seemed to accept that, but Jack noticed a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The boy had a way of looking at him, like he could see straight through the walls Jack had spent years building. As they approached the center of town, the crowd thickened. A small group had gathered outside the town hall, their voices raised in frustration. Jack spotted Eleanor at the center, her tall figure unmistakable even among the chaos. She stood with an air of calm authority, though her cheeks were flushed from the cold and the heated discussion. "You don't understand what's at stake," one man was saying, his voice sharp with anger. "That mall will bring jobs, tourists. This town needs it. And what happens to the children at St. Mary's?" Eleanor countered, her voice steady. "Where will they go when their home is torn down? Do you think they'll care about your shopping mall when they're sleeping on the streets?" The man opened his mouth to retort, but Eleanor didn't give him the chance. "I'm not here to take anything from you," she continued, addressing the crowd now. "I'm here to help. But I can't do it alone." Jack lingered at the edge of the group, watching her with quiet curiosity. There was something about her, something genuine in her determination that he hadn't expected. Sam, however, had no such reservations about staying on the sidelines. Before Jack could stop him, the boy darted forward, slipping through the crowd until he was standing beside Eleanor. "She's right," Sam said, his voice small but surprisingly firm. "The orphans don't have anywhere else to go. If you take the home away, what's left for us?" The crowd fell silent, surprised by the boy's boldness. Even Eleanor looked momentarily caught off guard, but she quickly recovered, placing a gentle hand on Sam's shoulder. Jack felt an odd mix of pride and apprehension as he watched the scene unfold. Sam's words carried a weight that seemed to settle over the group, softening the tension. After a moment, the man who had spoken before let out a huff and shook his head. "We'll see," he muttered, turning to leave. The crowd began to disperse, murmurs of uncertainty replacing the earlier anger. Eleanor knelt beside Sam, smiling warmly. "You've got away with words," she said. "Thank you." Sam grinned, and for a moment, Jack saw a light in the boy's eyes that reminded him painfully of someone he'd lost long ago. When Eleanor straightened, her gaze landed on Jack. He hadn't intended to stay long enough to be noticed, but it was too late now. She approached him with a curious expression, Sam trailing close behind. "You're Jack Sullivan," she said, extending a hand. "I've heard about you." Jack hesitated before shaking her hand briefly. Not sure what you've heard, but I wouldn't believe most of it. Eleanor smiled faintly. The good deeds are hard to miss, even if you try to hide them. I'm Eleanor Ward. I know, Jack said simply. She raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Sam speaks highly of you, she said, glancing at the boy. He says you're helping him find his family. Jack glanced at Sam, who looked up at him with unguarded trust. I'm just looking into a few things, Jack said. No promises. Well, Eleanor said, her tone thoughtful. Maybe I can help. I have resources that might make the search easier. Jack wasn't sure how to respond. He wasn't used to accepting help, especially not from strangers. But something in Eleanor's demeanor, her calm confidence, her willingness to fight for what she believed in, made him think twice. Maybe, he said finally, but I'm not making any promises. Eleanor nodded, as if she'd expected no less. That's good enough for me. As she and Sam walked away, Jack felt a strange sense of unease. He'd spent years avoiding connections, keeping his life small and manageable. But now, with Sam's innocent hope and Eleanor's determined resolve pulling at him, he wondered if it was time to let the walls crack just a little. Days passed, and Jack found himself reluctantly drawn deeper into Sam's world. The boy had a way of showing up when Jack least expected it, always with a new question, a bright smile, or that old camera clutched tightly in his hands. Jack didn't have the heart to send him away, though he often pretended to be too busy to engage for long. The truth was, Jack found himself strangely comforted by Sam's presence, even if he didn't fully understand why. One afternoon, as a heavy snowfall blanketed the town, Jack worked in his shop while Sam hovered nearby, doodling in an old notebook he'd found on one of Jack's shelves. The boy's chatter filled the quiet room, a pleasant distraction from the usual solitude. Do you think the snow looks the same everywhere? Sam asked, looking up from his sketch. Like in the mountains or the city? Or do you think it's different here? Jack paused, his hands stilling over the clock he was repairing. I suppose snow is snow, he said after a moment, but maybe it feels different depending on where you are. Sam nodded thoughtfully. I bet it feels special here. Before Jack could respond, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. He frowned, not used to visitors, especially in the middle of a storm. He opened the door to find Eleanor standing there, her coat dusted with snow, a look of quiet determination on her face. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said, stepping inside before he could protest. Her sharp eyes took in the workshop, lingering briefly on Sam, who grinned at her from his spot on the floor. What is it? Jack asked, his tone wary but not unkind. Eleanor wasted no time. I've been making calls about Sam, she said, her voice low and serious. It hasn't been easy, but I found something. Jack's heart sank. He wasn't sure if he wanted to hear what she had to say. He had convinced himself that helping Sam was a simple act of kindness, nothing more. But Eleanor's words threatened to pull at threads he'd carefully kept knotted for years. What did you find? He asked reluctantly. Eleanor hesitated, her gaze flickering to Sam. Maybe we should talk privately. Jack shook his head. Sam deserves to hear it, whatever it is. Eleanor nodded and sat down, her expression softening. There's a record of a woman who stayed briefly at a shelter about 9 years ago, she began. She left no name, only a description that matches the one in the photograph from Sam's medal. Jack's stomach tightened. He had avoided studying the photograph too closely, afraid of what he might see. But now, the edges of the truth began to sharpen in his mind. She left the shelter not long after, Eleanor continued. But the records mention a boy, Sam, born around the same time. Sam perked up, his eyes wide. That's me. Eleanor smiled gently. It could be. There's more, but it's complicated. Jack leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. Complicated how? Eleanor hesitated. The shelter staff said the woman was terrified. She didn't stay long enough to give many details, but she mentioned being followed. Whoever she was running from, she thought they were dangerous. Jack's jaw tightened. Memories he had buried long ago began to surface, fragments of a life that had ended in tragedy. A familiar fear settled in his chest, but he forced it down. What does this mean for Sam now? he asked, his voice steady despite the storm building inside him. "It means we have a lead," Eleanor said, "but it also means we need to be careful. If there's any chance the person she was afraid of is still out there." Her words trailed off, leaving the implication hanging heavy in the air. Sam, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "I'm not afraid," he said, his voice steady but soft. "If it means finding out who my family is, I want to do it." Jack looked at the boy, his chest tightening further. There was a bravery in Sam that reminded him so much of someone else, a spark of resilience that felt achingly familiar. Eleanor broke the silence. "I've arranged for someone to help us dig deeper into this. A friend of mine in the city specializes in tracking down missing people. But we'll need to be prepared for whatever we find." Jack nodded, though the weight of her words pressed heavily on him. He wasn't sure he was ready to face the answers that might come. But for Sam's sake, he knew he couldn't walk away. As the evening wore on, Eleanor stayed for dinner, a quiet but welcome presence at Jack's small table. Sam chattered endlessly, filling the silences with stories about the other children at the orphanage and his dreams of traveling the world someday. Jack found himself listening more than he spoke, watching the boy with a mix of admiration and protectiveness. After Eleanor left, taking her usual air of authority and confidence with her, Jack sat alone by the fire. Sam had fallen asleep on the worn couch, the old camera clutched in his hands. Jack stared at the boy for a long time, the firelight casting flickering shadows across the room. The truth was beginning to take shape in his mind, even if he wasn't ready to fully acknowledge it. The way Sam had appeared in his life, the uncanny familiarity he felt every time the boy looked at him, it all pointed to something he wasn't sure he could handle. And yet, he couldn't deny the warmth that had begun to spread in the coldest corners of his heart. Jack leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He had spent years running from his past, building walls so thick that even he couldn't see over them. But now, with Sam asleep nearby and Eleanor's revelations stirring something deep inside him, Jack felt those walls beginning to crack. The storm outside raged on, but inside the small workshop, there was a quiet hope growing. It was fragile, like the first green shoots breaking through the snow, but it was there. And for the first time in a long time, Jack allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth fighting for. The next morning, Jack woke to the sound of Sam moving about the workshop. He had taken to sleeping there since Jack had insisted the boy couldn't wander the streets after dark, especially with the storm worsening. Jack had tried to convince himself it was only temporary, but deep down, he knew otherwise. Sam was perched by the window, the old camera hanging from his neck, and the snow outside catching his attention. He turned when he heard Jack stirring, his face lighting up in a way that made Jack feel both lighter and heavier at the same time. "Good morning," Sam said brightly. "Look, the snow's so deep I can barely see the tops of the fences." Jack rubbed his face, shaking off sleep. "Guess we'll have to dig our way out," he muttered, though he couldn't help but smirk at Sam's enthusiasm. The boy had a way of making even the bleakest days feel a little less heavy. As Jack started a pot of coffee, there was another knock at the door. He frowned, not used to so many visitors, and opened it to find Eleanor standing there once again. This time, she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a man in his early 40s, dressed sharply in a coat that seemed far too expensive for the humble streets of Brindlebrook. He carried a leather satchel slung over his shoulder and looked at Jack with a mix of curiosity and professionalism. "Morning, Jack," Eleanor said, brushing snow from her coat as she stepped inside. "This is Peter. He's the friend I mentioned, the investigator. He's here to help us with Sam's case." Jack glanced between them, his instinct to keep outsiders at arm's length kicking in. "Not sure we need more people poking around." Peter stepped forward, offering a hand. "I understand your hesitation, Mr. Sullivan, but I've been doing this a long time, and I'm good at what I do. If there are answers out there, I'll find them." Jack hesitated before shaking Peter's hand. "Just don't make promises you can't keep." Peter nodded, his expression earnest. "Fair enough." Sam, who had been watching from the corner, moved closer, his excitement barely contained. "You're going to help find my family?" he asked, looking up at Peter with wide eyes. Peter crouched slightly, meeting Sam at eye level. That's the plan, kiddo. But I'm going to need your help too. Can you tell me everything you remember about where you came from? Sam bit his lip, thinking hard. I don't remember much, he admitted. Just the metal. And sometimes I have dreams. About a woman. She's always smiling, but she looks sad too. Peter nodded, scribbling in a small notebook he pulled from his pocket. That's a good start. As Peter began asking Sam more questions, Eleanor pulled Jack aside. I know this is a lot to take in, she said quietly, but Peter's the best. He can connect dots most people don't even see. Jack glanced at Sam, who was now animatedly describing his dreams to Peter, the old camera swinging from his neck. I just don't want him to get his hopes up, Jack said. It's not fair to him. Eleanor placed a hand on his arm, her gaze steady. Sometimes hope is all people have. And if there's even a chance we can give Sam the answers he's looking for, isn't it worth trying? Jack didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure if it was worth it, not because he didn't want Sam to find his family, but because he feared what the truth might mean for them both. By mid-morning, Peter had gathered enough information to start his work. He promised to return in a few days with updates and left with Eleanor, who gave Jack one last reassuring look before heading out into the snow. Jack spent the rest of the day trying to focus on his usual tasks, but his thoughts kept drifting to Sam and the tangled mystery surrounding him. The boy, however, seemed oblivious to Jack's unease. He spent hours tinkering with the camera, snapping photos of the workshop and even convincing Jack to pose for one. You'll thank me later, Sam said, grinning as he adjusted the camera's focus. You'll need a picture of yourself to remember this place when you're old. Jack shook his head but let the boy take the photo. He couldn't remember the last time he'd allowed himself to smile, but Sam's infectious energy made it impossible not to. That evening, as the snow fell heavier outside, Jack and Sam sat by the fire. Sam flipped through the few prints he'd managed to develop, proudly showing them to Jack. You're not half bad, Jack admitted, studying a picture of the old clock he'd been repairing earlier. Maybe you've got a knack for this. Sam beamed. Maybe I'll be a photographer someday. Like you used to be. Jack froze, the boy's words hitting a nerve he hadn't expected. He hadn't talked about his photography in years, not since the accident that had stolen his wife and daughter. The camera had been his connection to the world, a way of capturing moments and telling stories. But after that night, it had become a painful reminder of everything he'd lost. How did you know I used to be a photographer? Jack asked, his voice quiet. Sam shrugged. I just kind of knew. You're good with fixing things, and you look like someone who knows how to take pictures. Jack stared at the boy, his chest tightening. Sam's uncanny ability to see through him was both unsettling and strangely comforting. He didn't press further, instead ruffling the boy's hair before rising to stoke the fire. As the night wore on, Jack found himself thinking about Peter's words and Eleanor's determination. For so long, he had avoided anything that might force him to confront his past. But now, with Sam asleep on the couch again, his small chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm, Jack realized he wasn't just protecting himself anymore. He was protecting Sam, and maybe, just maybe, that was reason enough to keep going. The days that followed were marked by a nervous anticipation that Jack couldn't quite shake. Peter had left town to chase down leads, and though the man seemed competent, Jack found himself growing more uneasy as time passed. He busied himself with his usual routines, repairing broken toys, delivering firewood, and trying to keep Sam entertained. But the boy's questions and quiet moments of longing were never far from his thoughts. Sam, for his part, remained a whirlwind of energy. He had taken to photographing everything. The trees heavy with snow, the stray cat that prowled near the workshop, even Jack himself when he wasn't paying attention. The boy seemed to find endless fascination in capturing the world through the lens, and Jack couldn't help but feel a pang of recognition every time he watched Sam line up a shot. It reminded him of how he had once approached photography, with wonder, as if every image might hold the key to something profound. One afternoon, while Sam was outside building a lopsided snowman, Eleanor arrived unexpectedly. Jack opened the door to find her bundled tightly against the cold, her cheeks pink from the wind. I have news, she said, stepping inside and shaking the snow from her coat. Jack closed the door behind her, his heart sinking slightly at her somber expression. "What is it?" Eleanor glanced toward the window, where Sam was still hard at work on his snowman. "Peter called me this morning. He's found more information." Jack motioned for her to continue, though a part of him dreaded hearing what she had to say. "The woman who left the shelter, the one we think might be connected to Sam. Her name was Emily Rose," Eleanor said. "She used an alias, but Peter managed to trace her back to another town about an hour from here. She lived there briefly before disappearing again." Jack felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "Disappearing?" Eleanor nodded. "It looks like she was trying to stay ahead of someone. Peter believes she may have been running from a man who had a history of violence. We don't know much yet, but he's working on it." Jack ran a hand over his face, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on him. "And Sam? What does this mean for him?" Eleanor hesitated. "We don't know yet, but Peter's confident he's getting closer to the truth." Jack leaned against the workbench, his mind racing. He had spent so long avoiding his own past that he wasn't sure how to confront Sam's. The boy deserved answers, but what if those answers led to more pain? What if the truth was something neither of them was prepared to face? Outside, Sam burst through the door, his face flushed with cold and his eyes shining. "You have to see my snowman," he exclaimed, grabbing Jack's arm and tugging him toward the window. Jack followed reluctantly, letting Sam's enthusiasm pull him from his thoughts. The snowman was indeed a sight. A slightly crooked figure with mismatched eyes made of buttons and a scarf that was far too long for its stubby neck. Sam looked up at Jack expectantly, waiting for his reaction. "It's unique," Jack said with a small smile. Sam laughed, clearly satisfied. "I think it needs a name. Maybe something like Frosty Jr." Eleanor chuckled softly, and for a moment, the heavy atmosphere lifted. Sam's joy was infectious, a reminder that even in the face of uncertainty, there was still room for light. Later that evening, after Eleanor had left and Sam was tucked into the makeshift bed Jack had set up for him, Jack sat alone by the fire. The warmth of the flames did little to ease the chill he felt inside. He couldn't stop thinking about Emily Rose, about the man she had been running from, and about the possibility that Sam's mother had spent her final years in fear. Jack reached for the small box he kept hidden in the back of a cabinet. Inside were the remnants of his old life, photographs of his wife and daughter, a few trinkets, and a camera much like the one Sam carried. He hadn't looked at these things in years, too afraid of the pain they would stir. But now, as he thumbed through the photos, he felt a strange mix of sorrow and resolve. One photo in particular caught his eye. It was of his daughter, Anna, taken shortly before the accident. She was smiling, her eyes bright with the same spark he now saw in Sam. Jack stared at the image, his heart aching with the weight of memory. The next morning, Jack woke to find Sam already awake, sitting at the table with the old camera in his hands. The boy looked up when Jack entered the room, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think we'll find her?" Sam asked quietly. Jack hesitated, then nodded. "We'll do everything we can." Sam seemed to accept this, his small shoulders relaxing slightly. He returned to tinkering with the camera, and Jack watched him with a growing sense of protectiveness. Whatever the truth was, Jack knew he couldn't let Sam face it alone. As the day wore on, the storm outside began to clear, leaving the town wrapped in a fresh, glistening coat of snow. Jack and Sam ventured out together, delivering firewood and checking on neighbors who might need help. It was a quiet day, but there was a sense of anticipation hanging in the air, as if something unseen was shifting. That evening, as they sat by the fire once again, Jack found himself opening up to Sam in a way he hadn't before. He told the boy about his photography, about the places he had traveled and the stories he had captured. He didn't mention Anna or the accident. Those memories were still too raw, but he shared enough to see Sam's eyes light up with wonder. "Maybe I can take pictures like that someday," Sam said, holding up his camera. Jack smiled faintly. "You already are." As the fire crackled softly and the night deepened, Jack felt a small but significant shift within himself. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope, not just for Sam, but for the possibility that the past could be confronted and healed. The next morning, the town was bustling. Brindlebrook always came alive after a heavy snowfall, with neighbors digging out paths, smoke curling from chimneys, and the sound of children's laughter echoing through the crisp air. Jack and Sam walked together down Main Street, the boy stopping occasionally to snap photos of icicles hanging from rooftops or the way the light caught the frost on a shop window. Jack found himself oddly at ease in Sam's company, the boy's curiosity and energy filling the quiet spaces that had once felt endless. Sam had a way of noticing things Jack had long since overlooked, the small beauty in the ordinary, and Jack couldn't help but feel a faint sense of pride as he watched Sam work with the camera he'd repaired. As they neared the town square, Jack spotted Eleanor waiting for them near the old fountain. Her posture was tense, her face framed by a scarf wrapped tightly against the cold. Peter stood beside her, his leather satchel slung over one shoulder and his expression unreadable. "Jack, Sam," Eleanor called, waving them over. "We need to talk." Jack's gut tightened. He could tell from her tone that whatever news they had wouldn't be simple. Sam, however, bounded ahead, his excitement untempered by the somber air. "What did you find?" Sam asked, his breath visible in the cold as he looked up at Peter. Peter knelt slightly, his voice calm but serious. "I found more about your mother, Sam." "About Emily Rose." Jack stood a few steps back, his hands in his pockets, his heart pounding. He had been bracing for this moment, yet now that it was here, he wasn't sure he wanted to hear what Peter had to say. "She was a brave woman," Peter continued, choosing his words carefully. "She loved you very much and did everything she could to keep you safe. But she was running from someone, a man who hurt her. She left the shelter we talked about because she thought he was close." Sam's brow furrowed, his grip on the camera tightening. "What happened to her?" Peter hesitated, glancing at Eleanor. Jack took a step forward, his voice firm. "Just tell us." Peter sighed. "Emily disappeared shortly after leaving the shelter. There's no record of where she went next, but the last place she was seen was at a bus station not far from here. Witnesses said she was carrying a small child." Jack felt a wave of nausea. The image Peter painted was too vivid, too close to memories he had tried to bury. Sam, however, seemed to absorb the information with quiet determination. "So she was trying to protect me," Sam said, more to himself than anyone else. Peter nodded. "That's what it looks like. But there's more." He opened his satchel and pulled out a photograph, worn and slightly creased. He handed it to Sam, who stared at it intently. The photo showed a young woman with kind eyes and a soft smile. She was holding a baby, her arms wrapped protectively around him. Sam looked at the image for a long time before finally whispering, "That's her." "That's my mom." Jack's throat tightened as he stepped closer to look at the photo. The woman's face was unfamiliar, but something about her expression, the quiet strength in her eyes, stirred a memory he couldn't quite place. "There's one more thing," Peter said, his tone cautious. "The man Emily was running from, his name is Thomas Brandt. He has a history of violence and manipulation. We don't know where he is now, but he's dangerous." Jack's fists clenched at the name. He didn't know Thomas Brandt, but the idea of anyone threatening Sam or his mother ignited a protective fury he hadn't felt in years. Eleanor placed a hand on Peter's arm. "Thank you for finding this. We'll handle the rest." Peter nodded, his expression softening as he looked at Sam. "You're a brave kid. Your mom would be proud of you." Sam didn't respond, still staring at the photograph. Jack knelt beside him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure this out," Jack said quietly. "You're not alone." Sam looked up at Jack, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "I want to find her. Even if she's gone, I need to know." Jack nodded, his resolve hardening. "We will." That evening, back at the workshop, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Sam sat at the table, the photograph of his mother propped up beside him as he worked on developing pictures he had taken earlier. Jack watched him from across the room, his mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but they painted a picture Jack wasn't sure he was ready to face. Sam's mother had fought to protect him, sacrificing her safety and perhaps her life to ensure he had a chance at something better. It reminded Jack painfully of the sacrifices he hadn't been able to make for his own family. As the fire crackled softly, Sam finally broke the silence. "Do you think she's still out there?" Jack hesitated. He wanted to give Sam hope, but he also knew the weight of false promises. "I don't know," he admitted. "But no matter what, we'll make sure you're safe." "That's what she would have wanted." Sam nodded, his small hands carefully arranging the prints he had developed. One photo caught Jack's eye. It was a picture of the two of them standing in front of the workshop, taken earlier that week. Sam had captured Jack mid-laugh, a rare moment of unguarded happiness. "You're good at this," Jack said, nodding toward the photo. Sam smiled faintly. "I learned from the best." Jack felt a lump in his throat, but managed a small smile. "Keep it up. You've got a gift." As the night deepened, Jack sat by the fire long after Sam had fallen asleep. He stared at the photograph of Emily Rose, the weight of her story pressing heavily on him. She had done everything she could to protect her son, and now it was Jack's turn to do the same. For the first time in years, Jack felt a sense of purpose stronger than his fear. He didn't know what the days ahead would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let Sam face them alone. The snow continued to fall steadily in Brindlebrook, muffling the usual hum of the town. Jack awoke early, the gray light of dawn filtering through the frosted windows of his workshop. Sam was still asleep, curled up under a thick blanket on the old couch, the photograph of his mother tucked beside him. Jack lingered for a moment, watching the rise and fall of the boy's small chest, before pulling on his boots and stepping outside. The morning air was sharp, biting against his skin, but Jack welcomed the chill. It cleared his head, helping him focus on the growing weight of decisions ahead. Eleanor's and Peter's revelations had shaken him, stirring memories and fears he had long tried to bury. But they had also solidified his resolve. He didn't know what the next steps would be, but he knew one thing. He would fight for Sam, no matter what it took. By the time Sam woke up, rubbing his eyes and yawning loudly, Jack had a small breakfast of oatmeal and toast waiting for him. The boy grinned as he sat at the table, immediately diving into his meal with the unreserved enthusiasm of a child who rarely had enough to eat. Jack found himself smiling despite the heaviness in his chest. "I was thinking," Sam said between bites, "maybe we can go to the bus station Peter mentioned. If that's where my mom was last, maybe we'll find something she left behind." Jack hesitated. He had been considering the same thing, but the thought of digging deeper into Emily Rose's story filled him with a sense of foreboding. Still, he knew he couldn't deny Sam the chance to find answers. "Let's give Peter some time to dig around," Jack said cautiously. "If we don't hear anything new, we'll go. Deal?" Sam nodded, though his disappointment was clear. "Deal." As the day wore on, Sam returned to his usual routine of snapping photos and exploring the workshop. Jack used the time to gather his thoughts, mulling over the next steps. It wasn't just Emily's story that weighed on him. It was the lingering question of Sam's connection to him. The boy's bright eyes, his quick smile, even the way he held the camera. It all felt too familiar. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that fate had brought Sam into his life for a reason. Eleanor arrived just after lunch, her expression more determined than usual. She carried a folder under one arm, which she placed carefully on the table before sitting down. "Peter called again," she began. "He found something." Jack's stomach tightened. "What is it?" Eleanor opened the folder, revealing a series of documents and photographs. "These are from a private investigator Emily hired years ago. Peter managed to track down the agency. Emily was searching for someone. Her family, maybe, or someone who could help her. But the investigator noted that she seemed scared, like she didn't want to be found herself." Jack scanned the papers, his jaw clenching. The photographs included blurry images of a man who fit Peter's description of Thomas Brandt. There was a menace in the man's posture, a coldness in his eyes that sent a chill down Jack's spine. "This is the man she was running from," Jack said, his voice low. "Brandt." Eleanor nodded. "We're not sure where he is now, but Peter believes he's still looking for Sam. We need to be careful." Jack's fists tightened. The thought of anyone threatening Sam filled him with a protective fury. He looked over at the boy, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, focused on assembling a puzzle he had found in one of the workshop's many drawers. "We won't let him near Sam," Jack said firmly. "Not while I'm here." Eleanor's gaze softened. "I know, But we also need to figure out what to do next. If Emily's search led her here, there's a reason. We need to follow her trail. Jack nodded slowly. I was thinking about the bus station. If that's where she was last seen, it's as good a place as any to start. Eleanor agreed, and they decided to visit the station the next day. Jack spent the evening preparing, packing supplies, and double-checking that the workshop would be secure in their absence. Sam, for his part, was uncharacteristically quiet, sensing the seriousness of what was ahead. The following morning, the three of them set out for the bus station. The journey was slow, the road slick with ice, but they made it safely to the small, run-down building on the edge of a neighboring town. The station was nearly empty, save for a bored clerk sitting behind a counter and a few travelers huddled in coats, waiting for their buses to arrive. Eleanor approached the clerk while Jack and Sam lingered nearby. She explained their situation briefly, showing the clerk a copy of Emily's photograph. The man frowned, studying the picture before shaking his head. "Sorry," he said. "Looks familiar, but I see a lot of people come through here. Can't say for sure." Disappointment flickered across Sam's face, but Jack wasn't ready to give up. He spotted a corkboard near the entrance, cluttered with old flyers, advertisements, and lost and found notices. Something about it drew his attention. He walked over, scanning the board carefully. Amid the mess of papers, one item stood out, a small, faded envelope pinned in the corner. It was addressed to Sam in careful, looping handwriting. Jack's breath caught. He pulled the envelope from the board, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink smudged but legible. "If you find this, it means I couldn't stay. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you the way I should have, but I hope you find someone who can. You're stronger than you know, Sam. Never forget that." The letter wasn't signed, but Jack didn't need confirmation. He handed it to Sam, who read it slowly, his lips moving silently over the words. When he looked up at Jack, tears were brimming in his eyes. "It's her," Sam whispered. "She left it for me." Jack knelt beside him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "She did, and we'll find out the rest of her story together." Sam nodded, his grip on the letter tightening. For the first time in weeks, there was a quiet certainty in his expression, a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. As they left the station, Jack felt a renewed determination. Emily had left breadcrumbs for Sam to follow, and Jack would make sure they didn't lose the trail. Whatever lay ahead, he knew they were one step closer to uncovering the truth. The drive back to Brindlebrook was quiet, the weight of the letter still hanging heavy in the air. Sam clutched the envelope tightly, his fingers tracing the faded edges as if the connection to his mother might fade if he let go. Jack kept his eyes on the road, stealing glances at the boy in the rearview mirror. Sam's expression was thoughtful, but Jack could see the emotions brewing beneath his calm exterior: hope, confusion, and the sting of longing for answers. Eleanor, sitting in the passenger seat, broke the silence. "That letter, it's a gift. It means Emily believed in Sam's strength, even when she couldn't be there for him." Jack nodded but didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere, trying to piece together the fragments of Emily's story. The letter was a clue, but it wasn't enough. There were still too many unanswered questions. Why had she chosen Brindlebrook? What had driven her to leave Sam at the orphanage? And most pressing of all, where was Brant now? By the time they arrived back at the workshop, the snow had picked up again, swirling in the wind as they hurried inside. Sam went straight to his usual spot by the fire, unfolding the letter and laying it on the table as if studying it would unlock more secrets. Jack and Eleanor exchanged a look, silently agreeing to give him space. After a while, Sam spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Do you think she wanted me to find this now? Or was it just luck?" Jack pulled a chair close to the table and sat down across from Sam. "I don't think it was luck. She left that letter for you, hoping you'd find it when you needed it most." Sam nodded, though his gaze stayed fixed on the letter. "I just wish I could talk to her. Ask her why she left, why she didn't stay and fight." Eleanor sat down beside Sam, her tone gentle but firm. "Sometimes, people make the hardest choices out of love. Your mom did everything she could to protect you, even if it meant leaving. She wanted you to be safe." Sam's eyes filled with tears, but he wiped them away quickly. "I just miss her," he whispered. Jack reached across the table, his hand resting on Sam's shoulder. "We'll figure this out, kid. You're not alone in this." The rest of the evening passed quietly. Sam fell asleep early, still holding the letter, while Jack and Eleanor stayed up, poring over the other documents Peter had provided. The blurred photographs of Brant loomed large on the table, a stark reminder of the danger that still lurked in the shadows. "We need to find out where he is," Jack said, his voice low. "If he's still looking for Sam, we can't wait for him to find us." Eleanor nodded. "I'll call Peter in the morning. He has contacts who might be able to dig deeper." Jack leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "I've spent so long keeping to myself, trying to stay out of the world's mess. But this is different." Eleanor studied him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "You've always cared, Jack. You just found ways to hide it. But Sam sees through all that." Jack chuckled softly, though there was no humor in his voice. "Yeah, he does. That boy's got a way of making me feel things I thought I'd buried for good." Eleanor smiled faintly. "He's good for you. And you're good for him." The conversation drifted into silence, the crackling fire the only sound in the room. Jack stared into the flames, his thoughts turning over and over. He had spent years running from his past, but now it felt like the past was catching up to him, through Sam, through Emily's story, and through the growing sense of responsibility he felt for the boy. The next morning, Peter called with an update. His voice crackled over the phone as he explained what he'd uncovered. "Brant's been spotted," Peter said. "He's been laying low in a small town a couple of hours from Brindlebrook, but he's still asking questions. He's looking for Sam, no doubt about it." Jack's grip on the phone tightened. "How close is he?" "Not close enough to be a threat yet," Peter replied. "But we need to be proactive. If he gets wind of where Sam is, it could get dangerous fast." Jack exchanged a glance with Eleanor, who had been listening quietly. "What do you suggest?" she asked. "I'll keep tracking him," Peter said. "In the meantime, you should keep Sam close. Don't let him out of your sight, and make sure you're prepared for anything." Jack thanked Peter and hung up, his mind racing. The idea of Brant anywhere near Sam sent a chill through him, but it also lit a fire of determination he hadn't felt in years. "We'll keep him safe," Jack said firmly, turning to Eleanor. She nodded. "We have to." The rest of the day was spent reinforcing the workshop's locks and making plans. Eleanor made calls to gather resources, while Jack walked Sam through basic safety measures without alarming him. The boy seemed to sense the gravity of the situation but didn't push for details. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered town, Jack sat with Sam by the fire. The boy was unusually quiet, staring at the flames with a pensive expression. "Jack?" Sam asked suddenly. "Yeah. Do you think she'd be proud of me? My mom, I mean." Jack's chest tightened. He looked at Sam, his expression softening. "I think she'd be more than proud. I think she'd be amazed by how strong and brave you are." Sam smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. "I hope so." As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. For Sam, for Emily's memory, and for the chance to build something worth holding on to, he would face whatever came their way. The air in Brindlebrook had grown colder, the wind biting sharper as the days passed. Jack kept Sam close, never letting him venture far from the workshop, while Eleanor worked tirelessly to track any new developments from Peter. The weight of Brant's presence lingered, unseen but palpable, as if the town itself had tensed in anticipation. One morning, Sam sat by the window, the camera dangling around his neck as he stared out at the snow-covered streets. He had been unusually quiet since learning about Brant, and Jack could sense the boy's growing unease. Jack busied himself with repairs, trying to keep his own worry at bay, but every now and then, he glanced at Sam, wondering how much the boy truly understood about the danger they faced. Eleanor arrived just before noon, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She stepped inside quickly, shaking snow from her coat, and Jack immediately noticed the urgency in her eyes. "Peter called," she said without preamble. "Brant's on the move. He's asking questions in the towns nearby, and it won't be long before he hears about Brindlebrook." Jack felt his stomach twist, though he managed to keep his voice steady. How close? Close enough, Eleanor replied. Peter thinks we have a few days at most. Sam looked up from his spot by the window, his expression a mix of fear and determination. What are we going to do? Jack crouched beside the boy, resting a hand on his shoulder. We're going to keep you safe, no matter what. You're not alone in this. Sam nodded, but his small hands gripped the camera tighter, as if holding onto it might give him strength. Jack straightened and turned to Eleanor, his jaw set. We need to be ready, he said. If Brant shows up, he won't find Sam without a fight. Eleanor hesitated, then reached into her bag, pulling out a map. She spread it across the table, tracing a route with her finger. There's another option, she said. We could leave. Get Sam out of Brindlebrook before Brant gets here. Jack stared at the map, his mind racing. Leaving Brindlebrook would mean abandoning the safety of the workshop, the familiarity of the town, and the fragile stability they had built. But staying meant risking everything if Brant found them. Sam's voice broke the silence. I don't want to leave. Jack and Eleanor both turned to him, surprised by the firmness in his tone. The boy stood by the table, his small frame straightened with resolve. This is my home now, Sam said. And if my mom came here, she must have thought it was safe. I want to stay. Jack's chest tightened. Sam's words reminded him of his own daughter, Anna, who had once spoken with the same quiet determination. He nodded slowly, his decision solidifying. Then we stay, Jack said, his voice steady. But we'll be ready. Eleanor didn't argue. Instead, she folded the map and tucked it back into her bag. Peter's sending someone to help, she said. A friend of his, a former cop. They'll be here tomorrow. Jack nodded, though the thought of relying on strangers still made him uneasy. He had spent so long keeping people at a distance that it felt foreign to let others in. But for Sam's sake, he would set aside his reservations. That night, as the wind howled outside, Jack and Sam worked together to reinforce the workshop's doors and windows. Sam treated the task like an adventure, asking endless questions about the tools and materials Jack used. Jack found himself answering with more patience than he thought he had, grateful for the distraction from the gnawing worry in his chest. When they finished, Sam looked up at Jack, his face lit by the warm glow of the fire. Do you think she'd be proud of us? My mom, Jack knelt beside him, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. I think she'd be proud of you, Sam. You're brave, just like she was. Sam smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. And you? Do you think she'd like you? Jack's throat tightened. He thought of Emily Rose, of the sacrifices she had made to protect Sam, and of the unexpected bond that had grown between him and the boy. I hope so, he said softly. I'm trying to do right by her. The following day, Peter's friend arrived, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Tom with a no-nonsense demeanor and a sharp, watchful gaze. He assessed the workshop's defenses with quiet efficiency, making a few adjustments and giving Jack a list of supplies to gather. You've done well, Tom said, his voice gruff but approving. This place is solid. If Brant comes, he'll have a hard time getting in. Jack nodded, his gratitude unspoken but evident. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope that they might actually be able to face whatever was coming. Sam, meanwhile, hovered near Tom, peppering him with questions about his work as a cop. Tom answered with surprising patience, his stern exterior softening slightly in the boy's presence. As night fell, the workshop took on a tense but determined atmosphere. Jack, Eleanor, and Tom worked together to finalize their plans, while Sam sat by the fire, scribbling notes in a small journal he had started carrying. Every so often, Jack glanced at the boy, marveling at his resilience. When the preparations were complete, the four of them sat together around the table, the fire casting long shadows across the room. The weight of what lay ahead hung heavy, but there was also a sense of unity, a shared resolve to protect what mattered most. As the wind howled outside, Jack looked at Sam, who was carefully tucking his journal and camera into a worn leather bag. The boy met his gaze, and in that moment, Jack saw not just a child searching for answers, but a boy with a strength and courage far beyond his years. Whatever tomorrow brought, Jack knew one thing for certain. They would face it together. The following morning arrived with a heavy stillness, the kind that seemed to hang in the air before a storm. The workshop was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old building as the wind pressed against its walls. Jack, Eleanor, and Tom moved with purpose, checking the workshop's defenses one last time while Sam sat by the fire, clutching his camera as if it were a lifeline. Peter had called early to confirm what they already suspected. Brant was close. The man's inquiries had brought him to a nearby town, and it was only a matter of time before he made his way to Brindlebrook. The plan was simple: keep Sam safe and hold their ground until help could arrive, if necessary. Jack kept his focus on the task at hand, but his mind churned with worry. Every glance at Sam reminded him of what was at stake. The boy had become more than a charge, more than someone to protect. He was family, even if Jack didn't fully understand how or why. Losing him was not an option. By mid-afternoon, the sound of a car engine broke the quiet. Jack and Tom exchanged a tense look before Tom moved to the window, peeking through the curtain. "It's him," Tom said, his voice low but certain. "Black sedan. Parked just down the street." Jack's stomach tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He motioned for Eleanor to stay with Sam, who was already looking toward the door with wide, anxious eyes. "What's going to happen?" Sam asked, his voice small but steady. Jack knelt beside him, gripping his shoulders firmly. "You're going to stay here with Eleanor. Do exactly as she says, no matter what. Understand?" Sam nodded, his eyes brimming with trust. "You'll be okay?" Jack managed a small smile. "I've been through worse. Don't worry about me." Tom joined Jack at the door, his expression grim. "Let's see what he wants." They stepped outside together, the icy wind cutting through their coats. Brant stood by his car, a tall, wiry figure dressed in a dark coat and gloves. His face was pale, his eyes sharp and calculating as they fixed on Jack and Tom. "Jack Sullivan," Brant said, his voice smooth but laced with something unsettling. "And you must be the one looking after the boy." Jack squared his shoulders, his voice steady. "What do you want?" Brant smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "What I've always wanted. What's mine? The boy belongs to me." Jack's fists clenched, but Tom placed a firm hand on his arm, a silent reminder to stay calm. "He's not yours," Jack said, his voice hard. "He's not anyone's to own. And he's not going anywhere with you." Brant's expression darkened. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. Emily thought she could run, thought she could hide him from me. But I always get what I'm owed." Jack took a step forward, his anger barely restrained. "You're not owed anything. You hurt her, and now you want to hurt him. That ends here." Tom stepped between them, his voice measured. "I suggest you leave, Mr. Brant. The authorities are already aware of your interests. You don't want to make this worse for yourself." Brant's smile returned, colder than before. "You think you can stop me? You don't know what I'm capable of." The tension hung heavy in the air, but before Brant could say more, the sound of distant sirens pierced the quiet. Brant's smile faltered, and his eyes flickered toward the street. Peter had delivered on his promise to send backup, and it was clear Brant hadn't expected the arrival of law enforcement. "You can walk away now," Tom said, his voice calm but firm. "Or you can deal with them. Your choice." Brant's jaw tightened, his confidence cracking. He glanced at Jack, his gaze lingering for a moment before he turned sharply, stepping back into his car. The engine roared to life, and within moments, the black sedan disappeared down the street, leaving a trail of churned-up snow in its wake. Jack exhaled slowly, the adrenaline still coursing through him. He turned to Tom, who was already dialing Peter to confirm the situation. "It's not over," Jack said quietly. "He'll try again." Tom nodded. "But not today. And now we have him on the radar." "That's a start." They headed back inside, where Sam and Eleanor were waiting. Sam's face lit up with relief when he saw Jack, and he ran to him, clutching his side. "He's gone?" Sam asked, his voice trembling. "For now," Jack replied, resting a reassuring hand on the boy's back. "But we'll be ready if he comes back." Sam pulled back slightly, looking up at Jack with determination. "I'm not scared. Not as long as I have you." Jack felt a lump rise in his throat, but managed a small smile. "You've got me, kid." Always. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The police arrived shortly after, taking statements and promising to monitor Brandt's movements. Peter called later to reassure them that Brandt's actions would not go unnoticed, and they had allies watching from a distance. That evening, as the storm outside began to settle, Jack sat by the fire with Sam. The boy had finally relaxed, his head resting on Jack's shoulder as he flipped through the photographs he had taken over the past few weeks. Each image told a story: a crooked snowman, the glow of the workshop's firelight. Jack mid-laugh. "You're getting good at this," Jack said, nodding toward the photos. Sam smiled sleepily. "Maybe it's because I have the best teacher." Jack chuckled softly, his arm wrapping protectively around the boy. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. They had faced the storm together, and while the future still held uncertainties, one thing was clear. They were a family now, bound by love, trust, and the promise to protect each other. As the fire crackled and the snow fell gently outside, Jack allowed himself to hope, not just for Sam, but for the life they were building together, one step at a time.